Last Wednesday night, I mentioned about this book that was handed to me by a lady at the First Presbyterian Church where we've been attending. It's called Undoing Conquest, Ancient Israel, the Bible, and the Future of Christianity. And it's primarily talking about Joshua chapters 1 through 11. And I introduced to you this particular author. Her name is Kate Common, and she is an individual that is part of the LGBTQ community, and she uh, kind of brings some of her ideas back to that, which we're not going to talk about. But it's interesting the perspective a lot of times that people have, what they bring to the table in their research, in their study, and that type of thing. So someone that has maybe a little bit different background than we do in some cases is able to lift the veil a little bit on how they perceive certain aspects of theology, how they read certain sections of scripture, and so forth. But it's not that big of a book, but if you ever want to pick it up and take a look at it, it is a very interesting read. And we've just been highlighting primarily the idea of the conquest recorded in Joshua chapters 1 through 11, and how most of the time within traditional circles, it's taken quite literally, even though in recent years, those who have been archaeologists have said that it's quite unlikely that the way it is recorded in the book of Joshua is the way it went down. And they've done a lot of research and study in the Hebrew Highland settlements that we introduced last week, and the suggestion is it is a counter story to the violent narrative we find in Joshua. And this is a summary of the book in many ways. Instead of Israel emerging through military invasion, scholarship has presented the Israelites as gradually emerging within Canaanite society. And there's some reasons why they emerge the way they do. There's elements of social collapse, migration, peasant resistance to some unfavorable circumstances, and a community formation. And we said last week that that explains a lot of why in the book of Joshua, it seems as though the conquest went unhindered. They conquered everywhere they went. But in the next book, Judges, we find that there is cycles of oppression, and there is the elevation of certain leaders that are called judges that lead them out of some of the oppression that's there, only to find that they go through this cycle in an idealized number, 7 cycles in the book of Judges. Well, if we understand that both Joshua and Judges are probably finished in their final form in the exile or post-exile, we can then begin to see a little bit different perspective of why it is written the way it is written. So Israel is being presented as conquerors in the book of Joshua. And there is evidence, though, that there is more from archaeology, the idea of social reorganization, resistance to certain oppressive systems. And that really does match up well to the book of Judges, and community building among marginalized people. So when you read the book of Judges, you'll find that the Canaanites have not been obliterated. In fact, they are in many of the communities that are mentioned in the book of Judges. Now, that brings us to a point that we talked a little bit last week, and I want to explore a little bit more, and that is Deuteronomistic theology and how it's kind of used its history and narrative to kind of reinforce what they are hoping to be into the future. And one of the things that we do when we read the Torah is you have a big story in the Exodus, the leaving of Egypt and moving toward the promised land. It's interrupted, obviously, as they wander in the wilderness in the book of Numbers, and there's a second giving of the law. And it is in that second giving of the law in the book of Deuteronomy that we find this Deuteronomistic theology that develops. And it is still building upon the Exodus, though, because the Exodus in many ways is kind of like a cultural memory that is helping to form the nation identity and the hope that the people would have even in the post-exilic era. And so as the people were oppressed in Egypt and there was an exodus, so they were oppressed in Babylon. And there is this exodus of not all the population, but at least a remnant that goes back to Jerusalem, tries to rebuild their lives, rebuild the city, and rebuild the walls around Jerusalem. And so the Exodus, in many ways, is kind of like that foundational story that serves as a national identity. This is the type of people we are. We're always emerging out of oppression and we are moving toward hope of a better tomorrow. So, with that in mind, what I want to talk about tonight is really this idea of what Joshua is reinforcing. And I'm calling it the Deuteronomistic history. Now, that's a mouthful, but basically what that's saying is this, that the worldview that you find in the book of Deuteronomy all the way through the book of Second Kings is really a lens of why things happened to them the way that it did. So if the book of Deuteronomy serves as kind of a model, you might say, the book of Deuteronomy is very clear that if you obey, you will succeed. You will be blessed. If you disobey the covenant, you will be cursed and you will be exiled from the land. And so the book of Deuteronomy finds its way into Joshua, not as much into Judges, even though it's in the background, but certainly by the time you get to Samuel, when they are looking for a king, and that kind of goes haywire with Saul, and he's replaced by David and then Solomon. And then later, after the tribes split, and now you have two kings, one to the northern tribes and one for the southern tribes. What you find is there's certain um, kings that are held up as models. And in the southern tribe of Judah, you find that the model that is held up is Josiah. And Josiah, in many ways, is this one that tried to bring reform back to the covenant and trying to get people to obey all the elements of the law of Moses. So what scholars are beginning to see is that Joshua is really kind of a historical outworking of a theology that's found from Deuteronomy through Second Kings, and it's drawing upon promises and warnings. And these promises and warnings is primarily found in the book of Deuteronomy, and it's couched in the language that is used. So we're going to look at a few different places in Joshua, and I'm coming back again tonight to Joshua chapter 1. So in Joshua chapter 1, you see in narrative form really what the book of Deuteronomy is saying. If you will obey Yahweh, you will have blessing and you will be in the land. If you disobey Yahweh, you will be cursed and you will lose the land. That's kind of the central point. And if you think of the main points of Deuteronomistic theology, this would be point number one. So I'm going to number them. There's 7 or 8 of them that I want to share with you tonight. So in Joshua chapter 1, you're going to notice some similarities to what happened in the Exodus. When you come to Joshua chapter 1, it says in verse 2, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I'm about to give them. So there's a crossing of the waters, just like Moses. The Red Sea splits and they cross over toward the promised land. Then verse 3, I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. So Joshua, in many respects, is the new Moses, if that makes sense. And he is doing some of the similar things that Moses did. So there's the parting of the waters and this idea of moving into territory, and it's outlined in verse 3. It says here, I'll give you every place that I promised Moses, and it's going to extend from Lebanon and from the great river, the Euphrates, and the Hittite country to the Mediterranean Sea. So that's the promised land as we know it. And no one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. Well, it doesn't take long to realize that that did not happen because there were a lot of people that stood against them and their settlement in the land at various points. But it says here, as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. So Joshua's the new Moses. He crosses through the waters, and now as he enters the land, um, he is given this commandment: be strong and very courageous. And here's the bottom line: covenant obedience brings success. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Keep the book of the law on your lips, meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything that is written in it. That's the key there. Everything that is written in the law. Now, this is many years later when they're in exile and post exile, and a lot of things have changed. Many of the people that were in Babylon stayed in Babylon. They married Babylonian women and they started families and all that type of thing. And this is almost a desire to get back to pre exile conditions. And it's trying to get the people through narrative form to represent a people of faithfulness to the covenant that was given initially to Moses. If you jump down to verse 16 in chapter 1, it says that the people will respond to this covenant opportunity again by making a declaration of commitment. They answer to Joshua, whatever you have commanded us, we will do, and wherever you send us, we will go. Just as we fully obeyed Moses, so we will obey you. Now, you might say, uh-oh, they didn't fully obey Moses. There were a lot of situations where they didn't obey Moses. But what we find here is this condition. Obedience brings success, disobedience brings cursing. So, this conquest narrative, in many respects, here is supposed to be kind of like the unifying story of the nation. So, all nations have unifying stories of their existence and their beginnings. We have it in ours as well. How many times do we hear we were established as a Christian nation? Well, that's a narrative that's not fully true. We were a nation that had many different diverse elements to it. But in the sense of this is what our identity is as a Western nation, we want to be considered a Christian nation. Now, what does that do, though? Once you establish that, then it gives justification to get rid of people who don't fit that same category. In other words, it can be then thrown upon people of other religions, even though supposedly there is supposed to be equal freedom for all religions in this country. But if it gets tied to the unifying story of we're a Christian nation, it can be justified to show prejudice against those who are not Christian, whether they're atheist, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, whatever it may be. So here's the first point of Deuteronomistic theology: covenant obedience brings success. Now, the second big point in this theology that you find in the book of Joshua as well is the land is conditional. In other words, God promised this land to us. However, You only get to possess the land if you're obedience in the land. And so Joshua is portraying a conquest narrative where it's a fulfillment of a divine promise, but it's also a test of covenant loyalty. So as they move into the land, if they do not keep all of the cultic um, uh, ordinances, ceremonies, and all that type of thing, then they can be kicked out of the land. Now, the land is being portrayed as a sacred gift from God. And God says you will have no problem possessing the land as long as you are obedient. So it's not really about the size or swiftness of their military. It's not about the amount of weapons they have. It's about the law. It's about obedience to the law. Now, this becomes crucial later in Judges, 1 Samuel, and 2 Kings, where exile is being explained as a result of covenant violation. So you're looking through a lens here in these three books, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, as the reason we are being defeated is we have disobeyed the covenant. Didn't matter that the Philistines had weapons of steel, didn't matter that other people had more horses or more resources that worked to the disadvantage of Israel in their loss. And so it's almost as if the military part of it is secondary to the covenant part of it, and that is what is assuring success if they will keep the covenant. Number three, also in the book of Joshua, is what is called herem. That is holy war. Herem is this idea of a total ban on anyone that is not a part of the chosen people. So it reflects some of the commandments that you find in Deuteronomy. Again, it's kind of reinforcing Deuteronomy's theology. And it is saying, when you get into the land, I want you to totally eradicate the Canaanites. I want you to get rid of the people, get rid of their livestock, get rid of their religion, get rid of their idols, get rid of their altars, get rid of all that. And it's supposedly a setup then for a prevention of the nation of Israel slipping back into idolatry. Now, what's interesting, I think the next time we have our study on Wednesday night, I want to. You've heard of the goddess Asherah. It is believed that the reason that that had such a strong influence upon the nation of Israel is because Asherah was thought to be the wife of Yahweh. We'll get into that next time where, now, why is this such a pull? Well, it's the same idea of goddesses and gods and goddesses in other religions that you can't split these up. This is what makes a powerful God, both not only the God, but his wife as well. So let's just set that aside for now. I'll come back to that with one study next time we have our study. So this holy war, though, is seen in two main ideas or two conquests. The first one is in Jericho. So if you go to Joshua chapter 6, you find the conquest of Jericho. And I'm just kind of perusing it here. I'm not reading it. Um, in verse 2, the Lord says to Joshua, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men." Now, it has a very unconventional way of winning this war. The unconventional way is they're going to march around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram horns in front of the ark. And on the seventh day, march around the city 7 times, All of this has symbolism to it. The number seven being the perfect number. It's the Sabbath day. It's the 7 days of creation. All that type of thing. On the seventh day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing trumpets. And when you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout, and the wall of the city will collapse, and the army will go up, every one straight in. Okay, so the narrative is saying this is how it happened. Archaeology says there's no evidence that this actually happened. Yes, Jericho was in ruins, but it was seemed to be through the natural attrition of time rather than a military conquest. So this idea of Jericho is being held up as okay, this is what we want you to do. Get rid of anyone that's not like you. Now, what's interesting, though, in chapter 6 of Joshua is there is even a difference, though, that is made as we think about the story of Rahab. If you come down to verse 21, it says here, they devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women and young and old and cattle and sheep and donkeys. But Joshua said to the men who had spied out the land, go to the prostitute's house, Rahab, bring her out, and she is delivered. So here is a non-Israelite who is spared, even though supposedly this holy war is to eradicate every non-Israelite. So that's one story of one conquest. Then when you get over to chapter 8, you have the story of the conquest of Ai. Again, the same encouragement. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. Take the whole army with you. Go up and attack Ai, for I have delivered into your hands the king of Ai, his people, his city, and his land. And it's a long chapter. And again, it is in narrative form of how the city is conquered, and so forth. Jump down to verse 24. It does seem to be a total harem type of war when Israel had finished killing all the men of Ai in the fields and in the wilderness where they had chased them. And when every one of them had been put to the sword, all the Israelites returned to Ai and killed those who were still back in the city. So complete annihilation. So what's going on here? The idea of a holy war, harem, the Hebrew word harem, is this idea of getting rid of that which could influence the people and their disobedience to the law. So, in many ways, it's yes about racial purity, um, but more important to that is religious exclusivity. Israel must not worship other gods. Therefore, we get rid of everyone that might um, tempt people to go back to these idols. So, in the book of Joshua, you have two big battles, Jericho and Ai, and then you have a southern and a northern campaign. It's not nearly the same detail that you have in chapter 6 and in chapter 8. Okay, number 4 is the idea of centralization of worship. So in the book of Deuteronomy, there are three things that are very important. There's only one God. No other gods exist, just one. There's one covenant, this covenant that God gave to Moses that's being renewed, and one place of worship. One place of worship. You're not allowed to have altars anywhere and everywhere. You just have to worship at the designated place. And that's why this story in chapter 22 of Joshua is found in the book. So if you go over to chapter 22 of Joshua, here you're going to have some of the stories about some of the eastern tribes and so forth. And, and one of the things that happens here is these Transjordan tribes decide that they are going to build an altar to worship who? To worship God, but that is not the approved place for the altar. So come down to verse 10. It says, when they came to Gileath, near the Jordan in the land of Canaan, so they're in the land of Canaan, the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half tribe of Manasseh built an imposing altar there by the Jordan. So it's not in the designated place, it's not in the designated city. And it says here, um, and when the Israelites heard that they had built the altar on the border of Canaan at Gileath, near the Jordan on the Israelite side, the whole assembly of Israel gathered at Shiloh to go to war against them. So, this very act of building an altar at a different place than the designated approved place causes a civil war. And they are threatening what I'm calling here the centralized place of worship. And Deuteronomy is very concerned about unauthorized worship sites. If you remember the story of Jesus meeting up with the woman at the well in John chapter 4, the Samaritan woman brings this issue up. Um, we worship at such and such a place, and you worship at that place. And Jesus makes a very profound statement. He says, "There's a time that is coming when you will not be worshiping at either place. You will worship in spirit and in truth." But the book of Deuteronomy is always concerned about the approved city, the approved spot where worship is to be conducted. So, number 5, there is leadership succession. Joshua, as I mentioned a moment ago, kind of mirrors Moses. He does some of the same things. So Moses commissions Joshua, and it's Joshua that's carrying on Moses' mission. And Joshua keeps repeating over and over and over again that they need to obey the Torah, just as Moses kept um, uh, telling the people to obey the Torah. He goes up, he receives the tablets on top of Mount Sinai, comes down, and they're worshiping a golden calf, and he breaks the tablets, and you know the story where Moses is always dealing with a people that are going astray. So Joshua is going to give a farewell speech, uh, calling upon people to keep the covenant, just like Moses did as they were entering the land. So there's a lot of parallels between Joshua and Moses, intentionally so. And the narrative is written in such a way to make sure you don't miss those parallels between these two. Number 6, there is covenant renewal ceremonies. Now, there's 2 of them in the book of Joshua. One is in chapter 8. So if you go over to chapter 8 of Joshua, you'll find that Joshua is leading the people in a covenant renewal. And here's the things that are going to be said as he calls upon them. In chapter 8, he after the story of Ai, you come down to verse 30, and it says, Joshua built on Mount Ebal an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel. Well, that's an altar of victory to celebrate the military victory, because we just said that, as I said, a moment ago, well, where's the centralization of worship? It should be in Jerusalem, right? Well, what we're going to find here is Joshua will build an altar, but it's for the purpose of glorifying God because he kept his word, and it's seen in this military victory. It says here, as Moses, verse 31, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the Israelites, he built it according to what is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of uncut stones on which no iron tool had been used. So here you have this dedication. And verse 32 says, there in the presence of the Israelites, Joshua wrote on stones a copy of the law of Moses. And all the Israelites with their elders, officials, and judges were standing on both sides of the Ark of the Covenant, facing the Levitical priests who carried it. Both the foreigners living among them and the native born were there. So even within the text of Joshua, you have a mixture of ethnicities that of people that are participating in this covenant renewal. It says in verse 34, Joshua read the words of the law, the blessings and the curses, that's Deuteronomy, just as written in the book of the law. And there was not a word of all that Moses had commanded that Joshua did not read to the whole assembly of Israel, including women and children and the foreigners who were living among them. So he's going to make sure that they know what the covenant stipulations are. Then as the book closes, in chapter 24, he does another covenant renewal. This time it's at Shechem. And this really does echo Deuteronomy more than Joshua chapter 8. And if you were to put Deuteronomy as a whole next to chapter 24, you'll see a breakdown of these four things: a historical prologue that retells the story of the nation, a covenant challenge, the statement of blessings and curses, and witnesses of people that are affirming that they're going to keep these commandments. Look at verse 14 of chapter 24. Now fear the Lord, Joshua says, and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods of your ancestors, the ones that worship beyond the Euphrates rivers and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And then verse 24, they make another commitment that that's what they're going to do. And the people said to Joshua, we will serve the Lord our God and obey him. And on that day, Joshua made a covenant for the people. And there at Shechem, he reaffirmed for them decrees and laws. And Joshua recorded these things in the book of the law of God. Then he took a large stone. He set it up under the oak near the holy place of the Lord. See, he said to the people, this stone will be a witness against us. It has heard all the words of the Lord has said to us. It will be a witness against you if you are untrue to your God. And then chapter 24 closes with the death of Joshua, which marks a new era beginning after his leadership is done. Number 7, Israel's history is being interpreted in this historical narrative theologically. And by that I mean the Deuteronomistic history is less concerned about objective history, whether it's all correct or not. It's more concerned about theological interpretation. It's interpreted through the events as reward, punishment, fidelity, and miraculous intervention when the people are not faithful to the covenant. So I do want to point out one example of this. In Joshua chapter 7, there's a story of a guy by the name of Achan. And he violates the ban of what is called devoted things. These are the things that are devoted to destruction. So if you come down to verse 10, the Lord said to Joshua, stand up. What are you doing down on your face? Israel has sinned. They have violated my covenant, which I commanded them to keep. They have taken some of the devoted things, the things that were supposed to be destroyed. They have stolen, they have lied, they have put them with their own possessions. Okay, jump down to verse 14. In the morning, present yourselves tribe by tribe. Okay, so we're going to see who the culprits are. The Lord chooses, the tribe the Lord chooses shall come forth clan by clan. The clan the Lord chooses shall come forth family by family. And the family the Lord chooses shall come forth man by man. I mean, he's getting down to the nitty gritty, to individuals. Whoever is caught with devoted things shall be destroyed by fire, along with all that belongs to him. He has violated the covenant of the Lord and has done an outrageous thing in Israel. So early the next morning, this is what happens, okay? They bring these clans in, they bring these families in, they bring these individuals in. And there's a man by the name of Achan. And verse 19, it seems as though they figure out Achan is the one who had taken some of the devoted things. Joshua says to Achan, "My son, give glory to the Lord, the God of Israel, and honor him. Tell me what you have done. Do not hide it from me." Achan replied, "It is true. I have sinned against the Lord, the God of Israel. This is what I've done. When I saw in the plunder a beautiful robe from Babylonia." Okay, Babylon is being introduced here, which is an interesting inclusion. 200 shekels of silver and a bar of gold weighing 50 shekels. I coveted them and took them. They are hidden in the ground inside my tent with the silver underneath. So Joshua sends people over there and gets this stuff, brings it all back. And Joshua says, he takes Achan. And verse 24, it says, Joshua took Achan the son of Zerah, the silver, the robe, the gold bar, his sons, his daughters, his cattle, his donkey, his sheep, his tent, and all that he had to the valley of Achor. And Joshua says, "Why have you brought this trouble on us? It's all your fault. He's the scapegoat. He's the one that brought all this upon us. The Lord will bring trouble on you today." Then all Israel stoned him, and after that they stoned the rest of his family, and they burned them. So violent stuff going on here. And it's all built upon this Deuteronomistic history and theology that is trying to be reinstated after the exile and in Babylon. And ironically enough, those who are editing make sure that Babylon here is mentioned, so, which is kind of an interesting angle that we see taking place, including Babylon in the story. Um, Finally, number 8, Joshua creates kind of what I call an idealized beginning. He presents an ideal picture. In this text, the tribes are unified, the leadership is faithful, um, the people are trying their best to obey the covenant, and when that all three of those things line up, you have victorious conquest militarily. Now, does it turn overnight? Probably not. Really, the book of Judges is a more accurate picture of what probably happened. That there's this give and take between the tribes, and there's conquest, and then there's defeat, and so forth. And I think this contrast is intentional. Joshua is establishing kind of a theological standard, um, and Judges is being more realistic as to how the land was taken and lived in. So, Joshua, you have to be careful. That's all I'm saying with Joshua. If you sit down and you read it and you think it's literal history, you're being fooled. It's an idealized type of book that is trying to reestablish the covenant. Now, we know that's a big, important thing when we realize that some of the post-exilic literature in the Old Testament, the book of Ezra, the people are condemned. Some of the men are told to divorce their foreign wives that they had married in Babylon. Ezra reads the law. You have this whole scenario set up again of trying to say, okay, we insist that the law of Moses, every jot and tittle of it, is going to be obeyed. So the scholarly perspective, though, is to say this type of history in Joshua was edited during and after the Babylonian exile, and it's giving us a perspective, not just of recording events. It's trying to give a rationale of why they were in Babylon in the first place. It's giving us a rationale why Israel lost the land, why the exile occurred, how the covenant theology is interpreting the national catastrophe that we see taking place in the history of the people. And this, I think, is probably simplifying in many respects some very complex situations of the back and forth, the give and take, the victory and losses that occurs whenever a people are pushing a frontier and trying to expand their territory. So the same thing will be done with this Iranian war that is being fought on behalf of Israel. They're trying to push further into Lebanon and beyond because that's their quest is to expand their empire. What will be interesting is the simplified explanations that are often given to us through the media and that type of thing will later be reevaluated by real historians, and they will be able to tell us that it's not all this or it's not all that. That it's a very complex situation, and we can try to draw some conclusions, but we also have to understand that there's a lot more there than what we are told through the media or through Netanyahu or through Trump or other leaders, that type of thing. So, what implications does that mean? I think the implications of Joshua 1 through 11 is that nothing is ever quite as simple and as straightforward as you find in these 11 chapters. It's very complex. And when the archaeologists get their shovel into the ground and they begin evaluating, you're going to find that the stories in Joshua do not mirror what's being found archaeologically in the settlement data that is being um, accumulated. So you have to be careful with Joshua 1 through 11. Even though people would like to use it to justify their own uh, their own empire building objectives. Yeah, well, God told Joshua, and if we're faithful, that type of thing, we'll be just as successful as they were. It's better to understand that the Bible contains different voices in it. And some of those voices, even in the text, challenge a conquest theology. I I already mentioned Rahab, but when you read the book of Jonah, um, you'll find that God is merciful toward a much more militaristic, aggressive nation in Assyria than the Canaanites. You read the book of Ruth, you see a foreign Moabite woman who is elevated as being faithful and beloved and taking care of her mother in law and that type of thing. And then you fast forward all the way to the New Testament. There's many more samples and examples that are in the Old Testament. But if you fast forward to the teachings of Jesus, he rejects the idea of enemy destruction and actually says, love your enemy. So you'll find there's shifts that are taking place over time, and that really is true with any history of any nation. There are shifts of how we view history, how we see ourselves, and what we're going to do with it into the future. So all I'm saying is this: the story of Joshua is hyperbolic. It's hyperbolic war rhetoric, and it is a common practice, not only in the ancient Near East, it is also true in any conquest history that you read. In Joshua, you read things like, we destroyed them all, we left no survivor, we utterly annihilated them, we wiped them off the face of the earth. Ancient inscriptions have phrases such as this. It's still used to our day. President Trump most recently said, we totally obliterated their navy, even though the Strait of Hormuz is still closed. We totally obliterated their air force, even though some of our equipment is being shot down. Different things like that, where you go, oh, this is hyperbolism, hyperbolic rhetoric that is being used. And in many ways, it's used to manipulate our perception of things. Sometimes it's used to manipulate other things, like the stock market. Oh, this war is about over. We've completely annihilated them. Well, you can control certain things with that type of rhetoric. So instead of viewing Joshua as kind of a literal description of a genocide, see it as a theological storytelling for a reason, to reestablish their national origin, identity, and legacy as they move forward post exilic experience. So here's the central question that Deuteronomistic history that's found all the way from Joshua through Second Kings is trying to answer. Why did Israel and Judah lose their land? Why did some go into exile in Assyria? Why did the other tribes go into exile into Babylon? And the answer that is given is because they violated the covenant. They violated the covenant. They violated the covenant. So if I could give you a narrative flow, this is how it would look with a one statement of each of these books. Deuteronomy, Moses renews the covenant, prepares Israel to enter the land. Joshua, the land is conquered and distributed among the tribes. Judges, Israel repeatedly falls into apostasy and chaos ensues. Samuel, there's a transition from tribal confederation to a monarchy. Three kings, Saul, David, Solomon. And then in the book of Kings, after Solomon's death, there's a dividing of the kingdom between the 10 tribes of the north and 2 tribes of the south. And gradually, there is a collapsing into exile of all the tribes. So, how do you use the book of Joshua? Well, Zionism and Zionistic movements want to justify imperial type of conduct using the book of Joshua. This is what God commanded Joshua to do. This is what we are commanded to do. Even within religious Zionism, there's significant diversity, though. So some are real extreme, some are more moderate. So you have to keep that in mind. Many of the biblical and historical scholars caution against using this book for any type of geopolitical conflict because a genocide cannot be justified. Innocent women, children, babies uh, is a war crime, and it can't be justified by any nation at any time. So here's how I want to conclude this study. Again, you can look at the book, but if I had to kind of summarize everything, here's how I'd summarize the last 2 weeks. Most scholars see it differently than the way the book of Joshua presents it. And they have found all kinds of villages and stuff that archaeologically shows a slow growth into that area. Uh, the harem is not historical. That should be an E, Herem. I don't know. I was using the vocal typewriter there, so that's why there's a misspelling there. In this, the harem is not historical, or it's rather ideological. It's an expression that is being used that, hey, we are still the rightful heirs of this land according to God. So as they leave Babylon, as they move back into this territory, they have a claim to it. And then finally, it's emphasizing Deuteronomistic theology and history. And it's a way of trying to show that the native population of Canaan posed a serious threat, and therefore it's justifiable to annihilate them, which never happened. There was never a complete annihilation of the Canaanites. So there's a lot going on here. And as you can see, this type of thing doesn't fit real well into an easy Sunday school type of lesson. When you talk about Joshua and you talk about Jericho and you talk about all of these things, and I think it's important to be careful in churches how we use this material. because it's such that it's not something that should be told, I think, to little kids in the first place. But when you try to show the complexity of it, it's really beyond the average church going parishioner's ability to comprehend it, to appreciate it, or even the willingness to want to understand it. So, anyways, that's my thoughts on this Unknowing Conquest book by Kate Common, and you can do with that book or this information what you want with it. But I found it insightful and helpful. So I'm going to close off our recording at this time, and we'll come back and talk a little bit.